Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the World Philosophy lecture series. Today is going to be a talk by Beth Harper. Beth is from University of Hong Kong, specialist of comparative literature. What is comparative literature to the philosophy students, right? I think the best way for us to kind of recognize the relationship between philosophy and comparative literature is that comparative literature is probably close to what we study as continental philosophy in our program. And mostly modern theorists that works on different literature. And this is actually the first time that I came across with a comparative literature specialist that can function in both Western and Eastern intellectual traditions. Beth worked on comparative literature project on tragedy and how the classical conception of tragedy functions as mediation of the future. How we actually conceive of the future was the previous project, and this is a new project you're working on, entering the sphere of comparative literature in gardening, leisure, and labor. So please welcome Beth Harper.
Great. Thank you so much, Takeshi. I think the sound is okay. Can you hear me at the back? Wonderful. It's a great pleasure to be here in Edinburgh. I'm very grateful to you, Takeshi, for having me here, and also to all of you. I know it's a very busy time in the semester, and we're just getting a little bit of spring weather in as well. So thank you so much for being with me to think about gardens and gardening time. I'm going to be throwing a lot of texts and concepts from both the Chinese and the European tradition at you today, so bear with me. But I'd like to start with some quotes to think with that I won't be explicitly talking about discursively in my talk, but have really helped me think about what are some of the big concepts about why do we care about our relationship to the natural environment, to the earth, what is a garden, how does it impact upon what it means to be a human being. The rose is without why. It blooms because it blooms. It cares not for itself, asks not if it's seen. I am the flower and the gardener as well, and I'm not solitary in earth's cell. The state is the coarse husk around the seed of life and nothing more. It is the wall around the garden of human fruits and flowers. Out of damp and gloomy days, out of loveless words directed at us, conclusions grow up in us like fungus. One morning they are there, we know not how, and they gaze upon us, morose and grey. Woe to the thinker who is not the gardener, but only the soil of the plants that grow in him or her. Flower after flower is specked on the depths of green. The petals are harlequins, stalks rise from the black hollows beneath. The flowers swim like fish made of light upon the dark green waters. I hold a stalk in my hand. I am the stalk. The workman ought often to be thinking, and the thinker often to be working. The most pleasing aspect of all farm work is that it affords the mind more time to think. How could planting not be a noble endeavor? Be content with this time and dwell in this order. Dwelling, I think, is very important here. Then neither sorrow nor joy can touch you. 安时而处胜，爱乐不能入. Okay, so you can all leave now. This is kind of that Walter Benjamin idea of a tissue of citation being the ideal kind of analysis of anything. Everything I give you now will be less than this, but perhaps we can come and think through some of these quotations at the end. Okay, so this project began by thinking about ecopoetics, environmental philosophy in two very different cultures. But these cultures are highly literary, scriptural, accustomed to view the world through a tissue of signs and associations on the one hand, but also agrarian societies who know what it's like to dwell close to the land. And it's hard to overstate, I think, how much we have lost this participatory dimension in our encounters with natural environments. In thinking through these pre-modern encounters today, I'm interested in different forms of mimesis and this knottiness of an eco-critical desire to, at the one hand, to decenter the human being, right, to bring so-called real landscapes to the fore, this constant refrain of kind of new materialism, vibrant agency, But we're also sensitive to how the more than human world so readily becomes a figure for literary, metapoetic, cultural, philosophical, political, and of course ideological concerns. I want us to think about gardens as ideal spaces which straddle the realism and referentiality debates. And to think about, when we talk about gardens, we're talking about cultivated, manufactured environments, right? It kind of implies a landscape design which shapes natural phenomena, giving a visible expression to a philosophical worldview, even if that cultivation, as we shall see, sometimes purports to be precisely the art of non-cultivation. So there are fertile cross-cultural pollinations between ways of gardening and ways of thinking, ways of being, indeed ways of thinking about being. A consciousness of how to dwell in and with the landscape, how to garden, to cultivate, to think, to build, but also how this can be harnessed to ideologies of power and control on the one hand, and freedom and releasement. This is not something that is new to modernity, but has existed for thousands of years. Agriculture, which I'll suggest today, sort of subsumes within it both horticulture, literally the cultivation of gardens, viticulture, the cultivation of the vine, is the very basis of civilization. But it's often also set up in some ways against it, right? The requisites for good farming that we need, good stewarding, good gardening, a sense of the stewardship of the soil being worked, a willingness to be guided by nature's laws as manifested by signs, and a respect for practices which are sanctioned by long experience have all but disappeared now in our modern age of agribusiness, kind of maximum profits, pesticides, mass production. So it's a sort of quest to ruminate on what is lost by this so-called technological process. And we'll see that this is, again, something not new to at least conceptualizing this idea of technological progress not always being progress, has been thought about for a very long time. We don't need necessarily Bruno Latour to think about gardens that are both nature and culture, right? There is this continuum of the garden space, something that is separated off, bordered, but also transformed by humans. The history of the word, paradise, right, for those of you interested in etymologies, right, means a walled garden in an ancient Persian language. We find gardens at the heart of Greco-Roman life, associated with intellectual pursuits. We have Epicurus's garden, Plato's Lyceum. Perhaps, these represent kind of different kinds of spaces. Epicurus's garden, a kind of withdrawal from urban life. Plato's Lyceum, this is the time where you're always also engaged in what it is to govern the polis, to be a member of the citizenry. And gardens are also a kind of sacred space, right? So the origins of the word sacred, meaning to separate, to demarcate, divide. So something that has been set aside as a kind of special sacred space. And in this sense, the garden is, I think, this invitation to do philosophy. So I'm going to start with Cicero, good old Cicero, the Roman Republic, philosopher, statesman. He has this lovely part of his De Senectute, which is on old age. I think it's always nice to be old and in retirement, thinking about the relationship to the land. He has this gorgeous meditation on the joy of watching plants grow, of gardening. He's delighted in nature and her vegetable productions. And in this passage, I won't read all of it, but this first little passage now, I pass now to the pleasures of agriculture, which give me inconceivable delight, to which age is no impediment, and in which one makes the nearest approach to the life of the true philosopher. For the farmer keeps an account with the earth, which never refuses a draft, nor ever returns from what has been committed to it without interest, and if sometimes at a small, generally at an ample rate of increase. Yet I am charmed not only with the revenue, but with the very nature and properties of the soil, etc., etc. I think, in here we have this language of delight, of course, and this enjoying of nature's fruits in and for themselves, but also, of course, this language of usury, of interest, of commercialism. And this is a tension that we see, throughout texts, both in China and in in the sort of Greek and Latin texts about this, the commercialization of garden space, of productive labor, and this sort of retreat and enjoyment from it, this kind of luxuriating decadence in the pleasures of the senses, but also an emphasis on gardening as a kind of ethical training. It's a training in patience, unpredictability, investment without the promise of gain. Of course, like here we have, this language of achieving gain, but it's always something that you can never fully be assured of, right? So the sort of future of the garden is always somewhat unknown. There's also this special relationship to time and to temporality, how one positions oneself in time, right? The here and now of the gardening. Think about Woolf's, Virginia Woolf, we've got some Virginia Woolf scholars in the room. Her emphasis on this, the chocolate earth, right, getting soil into the fingernails, but again, it's already become a kind of aestheticizing trope. Right? So gardening brings you into the moment, but it's also engaged with both past and future time, right? You're kind of moving with the seasons, and you're seeding a hope for the promise of a future harvest. Plants of the garden must be tended, nurtured now. But there's this ambivalent relationship. Gardens perform in cycles, they reflect the seasons, they incorporate death and decay. Gardens remember and anticipate, and they take the gardener with it. At the heart of the mythos of Christianity, of course, the first humans are gardeners. Here we have a lush, Cranach the Elder portrayal of the Garden of Eden. Born into sin through their own transgression, the very punishment of Adam and Eve, of course, is to be expelled from their garden. And they move from this languorous pre-upsarian gardening to toiling agriculture, right, through sweat of the brow. They become kind of farmers of the land. And this movement from pre-upsarian gardening to agricultural labor mirrors a decline of the Golden Age that we see in other writers like Hesiod, archaic Greek writer, the Works and Days, and also reworked in Ovid's Metamorphoses, right? So this idea of a prelapsarian perfect time where the earth gives sua sponte, right, spontaneously of itself, is quite prevalent in the Western tradition. And we also have intimations of it in the Chinese side with, in the Shanhai Jing, we have Mount Ponglai. Again, this is a space in which there's no winter, there's no pain, all food is provided for, and these kinds of paradises. We have the myth of a kind of golden age also in the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi's idea of the men of old, this kind of Earth-side kind of aged time where there was no technology and people lived in continuous harmony with their natural environment. So you don't need to wait for Rousseau for this kind of thinking about idealized pasts. Paradise haunts gardens, but gardens haunt utopias. Their conditions mimic those for an ideal society and are one of its abiding metaphors. So gardens are not a farm, they're not a wilderness, but they encompass beauty, delight. They're a site of both labor and leisure, and a place where the two might be joyfully confused. So to think about gardening as a process rather than a place or a locality, this process of creation and maintenance. And I'll be giving you some examples of powerful metaphors of growing plants as a kind of self-cultivation that stretch back to the roots of both Chinese and European philosophical traditions. Pindar, lovely Greek poet, perhaps the first to inaugurate this alignment of the art of living with the art of gardening, this gorgeous line. But human excellence grows like a vine tree, fed by the green dew, raised up among wise men and just to the liquid sky. Liquid sky. And this is actually, Martha Nussbaum cites this at the beginning of her magisterial tome, right? The Fragility of Goodness, Look and Ethics in Tragedy and Philosophy. And there's also a little kind of amplificatio of this in Nietzsche, for those of you who like Nietzsche. Oh, my soul, I gave your soil all my wisdom to drink, all new wines, and also all unthinkably old and strong wines of wisdom. Then you grew for me like a vine, over rich and heavy. You stand there now, a vine with swelling udders and crowded brown gold grapes. Not quite sure what's going on here with this imagery, but the soul is kind of being so expanded, it's like needing to be milked. But I think this is tying back to Pindar's ode. So here, the excellence of the good person is like a young plant, right? Something growing in the world, slender, fragile, in constant need of food from without. In other examples, we have Plutarch talks about the cultivation of crops as a metaphor for ideas of education, and perhaps most powerfully, we have Socrates in Xenophon's Economicus, who writes, "Quite high and mighty people find it hard to hold aloof from agriculture, combining as it does a certain sense of luxury with the satisfaction of an approved estate. And such a training of physical energies as shall fit a man to play a free man's part." Right? So this is very interesting, this explicit link about learning how to be free. "For myself, I marvel greatly if it has ever fallen to the lot of freeborn man to own a choicer possession or to discover an occupation more seductive or of wider usefulness." So again, it's that utilitarian and aesthetic, right? It's seductive and it has applied use value. "Earth of her own will give lessons in justice and uprightness to all who can understand her meaning, since the nobler the service of devotion, the ampler the riches of her recompense." So this is this sort of idea that this investment that pays off, right? That if you are a good steward, a good gardener, a good farmer, you will be ushered into the true justice of the polis and what it is to exercise one's spiritual and civic freedom. There's also this sort of idea of a mutually constitutive, symbiotic relationship with the natural world, in which lessons of effort, devotion, right, cultus, meaning both to cultivate and to worship, are meted out by a kind of the supreme teacher, which is nature herself. And there's another quote from Cicero, again, like laying on this nothing is better than agriculture, nothing richer, nothing sweeter, nothing more fitting for a free man. Not sure how much Cicero farmed as opposed to watched things grow in his old age, and this is always the tension, right? To what extent these are sort of constructions of idealized relationship to the land, and this is papering over the fact, of course, that Greece is not a free state for most of the people who are involved in it. Of course, this is only for free-born Athenian males. Another nice example, though, that I found, because it's female, although she is a goddess, so she has special dispensation. This is Aeschylus's Eumenides, which is the final installment of Aeschylus's Oresteia, which of course begins with the Agamemnon. This is a very dark play about sacrificing your daughter for what is justice, for a greater goal. And we move through kind of lots of murder and sacrifice with the family. And then by the third play, we're in this dispensation where everything has to be reconciled to the state, right? What is the state of Athens? How does it bring everyone together? How do we suture over these old wounds? How do we justify, it's a kind of self-justifying mythology for the Athenian polis. And I think I just found this is so interesting because Athena specifically describes herself as a gardener, like a gardener, right? It's a simile, but may be ready to promote the fertility of those who worship well, for I cherish like a gardener the progeny of these people who are so just and must be protected. So to garden is to nourish life, to control it, to protect it. But of course, there's always this darker side to who is doing the stewarding and why. Who decides what constitutes proper cultivation, what needs to be rooted out? Toni Morrison is one of my favorite authors, reminds us all paradises, all utopias are designed by who is not there, by the people who are not allowed in. If Athens is the original garden state, stewarded by Athena, the supreme gardener, it is this garden state reserved for free citizen males, and really citizen males from Athens specifically. Right? This is kind of autochthonous myth of Athens being born, right? Athenians are born from the earth and they have this very special dispensation to rule. So this linkage of power and gardening is one to bear in mind. Persia, for example, Cyrus the Great was famous for his gardens. Xenophon and Cicero make the connection between gardening and power. Cyrus plants his own trees. This is a symbol of a kind of political control. Plants can be uprooted, they can be resettled, and to garden like this is to control the world. So there are myriad conceptual metaphors then for gardening about both the life of the individual, but also how it relates to human institutions that exercise the realpolitik of empire building. Okay, so step outside for a minute. If we think about ancient China, we find the garden is a poetic fixture as old as poetry itself. So the Shijing, which is, goes back to the age of Homer, maybe even earlier, sort of 11th, 7th century, famously compiled by Confucius, right, supposedly. But there are several words for garden found in the Shijing, and these are a few of them, right, which are quite fine distinguished, right? So there's pu, which is the kind of cultivated plot. This is the more humble kind of kitchen garden. Yuan is one of the most common, right? Yuanlin, this is the kind of the garden, private gardens. And then you would be the large imperial parks, right, that would often have animals in them. And I put the Chinese characters there because I think it's, you really see in the Chinese character this idea of enclosure, right? There's something that is demarcated, that is separated off for different purposes. So private gardens in China are found as early as the Han. Some people would even say maybe even as far back as the Shang dynasty, that there are kind of examples of that. But these are large imperial designs. It's not until the 6 dynasties, so I realize that now timelines of Chinese dynasties might not be familiar to everyone. 6 dynasties, sort of 3rd to the 6th century, that there's this kind of huge surge in ownership of private gardens, particularly by the literati. And this has an influence on the development of what gardens signify. Someone like Pan Yue, do I have him on the slide? Yes, Pan Yue, dwelling at leisure, this is the Xianju Fu. He's one of the earliest to kind of exemplify this idea of failing in your civic life, right? And choosing a life in reclusion, right? So in China, you have this very rich eremitic tradition of recluses choosing, or, this is always, again, this rhetoric of naturalness, and how much do we believe that this is a sort of choice, and you're also being let go from your job, right? You're failing in one area of your life, and then you choose to go to the countryside and set up a different kind of way of living. But the Pan Yue example is really gorgeous, I think, because so he meticulously details this contemplative serenity, right? Observing trees, talking about fish gliding by. And in a later bit of this ode, which I haven't put here, there's also his mother who visits, and this becomes this kind of communal space and this moment of bonding between mother and son, and it really is a kind of therapeutic praxis, right? So I think the way that gardens are being used as a kind of therapeutic saving of the soul is very, very old in China. And Tao Yanming is probably the most famous example of this kind of 6 dynasties retreat literature, and I'll come back to him at the end. Just to give a little potted, so by the mid-Tang, this new would-be hermit finds a new space in urban private gardens. So as we move forward through time, right, in the Song and the Ming, so kind of 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, we're moving into a more commercial, mercantile society. And then the art of gardening starts to become, or it has this strain in it, where it's nothing to do with genuine reclusion, a genuine kind of philosophical space, but much more about conspicuous consumption, about show-offery, about my garden is more, well plotted and philosophically oriented than yours, but I don't spend any time in it because I'm always at my other estates in wherever. And this is also a time where you have lots of innovations in horticulture, so grafting, the explosion of different kinds of flowers and innovations. And I think, whenever you get this kind of development of a form, right, this kind of use of grafting and technological innovation, you also get this concomitant moral discourse, right, on how this is taking us away from the purity of what the garden should be for. Bai Juyi in the Tang, right, for those of you who know Tang poetry, he's a great one for sort of criticizing everybody else who, you know, they don't really know what it is to dwell in a garden, right? They're not philosophically attached to the space, but I am, right? I have my own estate, and I know, you know, kind of how to dwell in it properly. And this idea that you need an aesthetic sensitivity, an aesthetic cultivation to be able to truly own a garden. But I think that question of like what it is to truly own something, what it is to truly, you know, dwell in and be known by a space is interesting. Despite being an agrarian society, it is sort of interesting, and there's people doing some work on this, like Raoul Sturks at Cambridge. He's the sort of early China guy, thinking about agrarian metaphors, like how like the use of farming as a kind of tool for thinking about civilization, of course, because in ancient Rome you have a text like Hesiod's Works and Days, which is specifically, you know, a work that is purporting to describe in great detail the farmer's life, right? What is it like to farm in Boeotia in the 8th century BC, okay? But it's also this moral commentary on that as an ideal form of living. And I don't think there's anything directly equivalent to that in the Chinese tradition, but if people know of one, please let me know. You get lots of scatterings of discussion of the kind of the rustic, the farmer, but you don't have somebody like, for example, Cincinnatus might be someone that's maybe familiar if anyone's been to Cincinnati in America. It's actually named after this dude. So Cincinnatus was a 5th century Roman. And he's held up by Livy. Livy was an ancient Roman historian. In his history of Rome, he's somebody who, you know, retires and goes to plow his land. Right? He goes back to the countryside. But in a moment of crisis, the soldiers come and they say, Cincinnatus, we need you to save the Republic, as you do, you know. And he's so held up as this model because he leaves his plow, he goes back to fight, and it's this sort of emergency powers. And the important thing is that he then goes back, right? He doesn't keep power, he doesn't hold power, he doesn't become a dictator, which, of course, Roman history becomes an empire, is full of that, right? So this is an interesting idea of the farmer as a statesman, which you don't find in the Chinese tradition because there is this kind of denigration. Well, it's both denigration and valorization at different points of the farmer, of the nong, right? The nongren, the nongzhe. And I think, you know, this is interesting. So someone like Liang Qichao, right? He's a 20th century Qing intellectual, I think sums it up really well here, right? He's like, 学之不农，农之不学, right? You can't, like, you need a separation of the spheres. You either, you know, this is a culture that is led by highly erudite literary people who spend their lives reading texts and thinking about ideas. You're not the peasant out on the field doing the work, or growing the food. So this is kind of this dichotomous world of traditional China, where farming is the bedrock of society, of course, right? And yet it must be renounced if you are to become a governing elite. Farming is where you start, but it should not be where you finish. And there's also this language, do I have it here? Yeah, of tuigang, guigang, right? To leave the plow and return to the plow. But this is a very different model to Cincinnatus, kind of going, you know, being called from his plow to perform military, you know, endeavors, become a dictator for a very short time, and then leave it again and go back to the countryside and be a good Roman citizen. This is really, you know, you return to the plow if you failed in your life. It's not a valorized kind of situation. So I think the agricultural labor is at once spurned because poor, common, but also valorized because agriculture, you know, is this sort of complex foundational myth on which the state builds its power, but then kind of disavows it. So I think it's interesting to think about the farmer or the gardener as this kind of bad other or disavowed foundation of very literate, very cultural, very philosophical societies. So to think about some of these philosophical texts and that involve thinking about growing things and what is the proper way to grow things. This is, those of you who have a background in Chinese philosophy, a very, very famous text from the Mencius, who, this guy, he's constantly pulling up his sprouts, and, he's like, why are they not growing? Why are they not growing? They're all withered. And this is about finding a kind of middle way, almost, right? Those who abandon them, thinking that they cannot benefit them, do not weed their sprouts, right? So you're not tending your garden, you're not doing what's right, but then you can overdo it, right? Those who help them grow pull up the sprouts, and they're not doing anything to benefit them, but they're damaging them, right? So there's this way of thinking, and you can see how easily, right, this becomes a metaphor for the arts of governance and kind of finding a middle way in the Mencius, right? So Mencius is a Confucian text, slightly different message to the Zhuangzi that we'll be looking at shortly. I think there's also this question of morality, like where does morality come from, or how does the right way to act come from? It can't be seized as a sort of external object, but it has to be something that is rooted and cultivated and comes through you. But then you have someone like Han Feizi, right, very sort of legalist text, so you think more of a hardliner than someone like Mencius, who generally believes that, people can be led to do good things. He who is the Lord of Men repeatedly prunes his tree so that the branches do not spread and proliferate. And again, I think there's this dark side of what it is to prune, right? Who's deciding who prunes and who gets pruned, right? How you're kind of controlling the state. This need for the good gardener, right? The measured gardener, the moral gardener, and how do we sort of marry that question of the art of governing, maintaining the order of the state, whilst also sort of not devolving into tyranny and violence. So gardening imagery then is deployed to explain the art of politics, of state governance, in Confucian legalist, and then and I think in a somewhat inverted paradigm in Zhuangzi. So the Zhuangzi, for those of you who know this text, is replete with images of trees, right, large, useless, deformed, this triumphant image of the power of uselessness, right, what is it to be truly useful, right? And I think, as a university student, the Zhuangzi is a great text to read, because there's this idea that, too much learning can harm your life, right? You need to just let it be, let it go, it's fine, be useless. You will live a long and happy and prosperous life because no one will vote you into high office and your life will be so much better. It reminds me of that, there's a bit in Peaky Blinders, those of you who like Peaky Blinders, where Tommy Shelby, this kind of gangster boss, he actually has a little moment where he looks at his gardener and he's just like, my gardener will know a kind of happiness and contentment that I never will, right? This sort of just dwelling, being at one with yourself and with the natural environment. Anyway, so we have the gardener as, the tree grower as a kind of gardener, right? This kind of original gardener figure. Zigong, this is a famous passage. So Zigong is a pupil of Confucius. And yeah, basically, I won't read it to you, but he sort of comes across this dude, this sort of farmer, gardener, Puxi, right? You have the pool here. He's sort of suggesting to him, you can do this so much faster, right? Why are you wasting so much time and energy watering, your own crops? You can use a kind of, what do you call it, like a well pull, a shadoof thing to do it faster. And, he replies, and this is the most important bit, right? The gardener, this is sort of second half here, the gardener put on an angry look, laughed and said, I have heard from my teacher that where there are ingenious contrivances, there are sure to be subtle doings. That where there are subtle doings, there is sure to be a scheming mind. But when there is a scheming mind in the breast, its pure simplicity is impaired. When this pure simplicity, this is this chunbai here, right? What is it to have a kind of purity or a clearness, right? A way of seeing the world and being with it. in which you are not working against it, but with it. The spirit becomes unsettled, right? So you need to protect your 身上, right? 身上不定. You need to make sure that your spirit is open and clear and free. It's not that I do not know, right? So this is not a lack of knowledge. It's not an epistemological kind of, oh, if only I knew how to improve my life through technological advances, I would be ashamed to use it. So I think this passage in the Zhuangzi is really, really interesting. It's one of the earliest skeptical of technology, right, moments in ancient text. And also this question, like, what does it mean to have a machine heart, right? So 机械 is a kind of mechanical tools, or 机心, right? This kind of heart mind. Sorry, no, not heart mind. The machine heart mind, right? The 机 is what is undesirable, right? That you become kind of predictable, reliable, prosaic, functional. You become a kind of like a tool, right? You seek reassurance, predictability, like it will always work like this. But you know, this is sort of asking us what we lose when we become this kind of machine-hearted person, where we're always seeking optimization, efficiency, the easiest way to do something, mass production, et cetera, right? This is all very familiar to, I think, you know, contemporary people. We're always being told to optimize and maximize and do all these things. But what is the value? What is the true value of that? It's also thinking about a transvaluation of value. And this is the Taoist position, perhaps, you know, leaning into the Confucian idea of, you know, if you act in the world, you know, education, production, like you do things, this is sort of suggesting another way. It's interesting that this is picked up in another text, which is very Zhuangzian, and this is from the Tang Dynasty, and you know, it's always the old or somebody on the fringe of society who has this kind of knowledge or insight into a better way of doing things. So here we have Guo Tuotuo, who's like this camel hunchback kind of creature, and he is an amazing tree grower, right? He just everything he touches just becomes this luscious, luxuriant plant. And everyone's asking him like what the secret is. And he says, I can't make a tree live forever or flourish. What I can do is comply with the nature of the tree so that it takes the way of its kind. When a tree is planted, its roots should have room to breathe, its base should be firm, the soil should be old, the fence around it should be close, right? So this kind of space, sacred space. When you have it this way, you must neither disturb it nor worry about it, but go away and not come back. If you care for it like this when you plant it and neglect it like this after you have planted it, so you do the work, right? You think about it and you plant it well, but then you leave it alone. Then its nature will be fulfilled and it will take the way of its kind. So all I do is avoid harming its growth. I have no power to make it grow. I have no power to bring it forward, et cetera, et cetera. So this rhetoric of the power of powerlessness, again, I think is very important, right? This is a sort of image of laissez-faire government in some ways, right? But this idea of not over-investing, not meddling, letting things be as they are, right? These are kind of key Taoist principles of working with nature and not trying to force things through your human hubris, right, into kind of wrenching and doing things. So you can see how this is on a kind of continuum with the Mencius, but whereas the Mencius is sort of like a middle path, this is much more kind of just let it be. And then here we have, you know, a specific link to the arts of governance, right? The art I sought was of cultivating trees, the art I found was of cultivating men. Let this be passed on to a lesson in all in office. Also all those in university administration, right? Like stop belittling, just let people do what they know how to do and, you know, fulfill their own xing, right? Their own kind of internal nature. Okay, so let's look at how we're doing for time. These are some examples of taking you back, well, forward, to the six dynasties, Xie Lingyun and Cai Yanming. So Xie Lingyun is a very interesting figure, I think, for the Chinese tradition. Again, I think I'm drawn to these figures a little bit like Horace and Virgil that we will get to, because they are very much embedded in this paradox of how do I kind of create a kind of freedom for myself within this larger superstructure of state's violence, of political turmoil, of duty, of Confucian, rights and care and all the rest of it. How do I negotiate these different personae that I have? And Xie Lingyun definitely is a sort of contradictory character. So he wrote this huge ode to my mountain dwelling, right, the Shanju Fu. It's very sort of, it sort of sets up something which is about being a recluse, being a wanderer, but it also kind of has this disavowed, or, this is also very mercantile, productive, interested in kind of, creating, owning land, taking up land. It's very imperial in many ways. So it's a sort of bit of a paradox. So he criticizes his contemporaries precisely for creating these cultivated parks and gardens, right? That these are sort of cultivated spaces. They're not the pristine shanshui, right? The sort of the mountains and the waters. That this is the wilderness. This is the purity. There's also this kind of Buddhist inflection to his writing, where you can live in this pristine wilderness, this perceived wildness. So this kind of language, right, is kind of all over Xie Lingyun. This intrepid explorer, scaling mountains, having this purity of vision. And then he'll say something like, reverently I receive the testimony of the sages, respectfully peer into scriptures from the past. Mountain wilds are clear and boundless. Settlements of men reek with the stench of sheep and fish. So almost, kind of setting himself up and above like this kind of sage-like figure who's not sullied by the stuff of the earth, right? But this is a fiction because, this was a vast productive estate that he creates for himself. It's not just like a little kind of potager garden. This is, the size of, whole provinces that he takes up and, diverts rivers for. And those of you who've seen Yellowstone, I have to keep popping in these, these just occur to me. But the idea of like owning so much land that you're kind of consolidating land. And there's a real kind of ethical problem with that, right? Like you're actually changing and occupying all of this space. And he also denies the slave labor, right, on which all of this is built. And so it's interesting because Xie Lingyun writes his own commentary to his own poem. Sort of give you an insight perhaps into his character. And he says at one point, right, without farmland, there is no means by which to establish oneself, right? So you have to have, right, 非田无以立耳, right? So you have to have the tian, right, the fields, the land. And he's using specifically this language of Confucius, where Confucius says, right, li yu li, right, you have to establish yourself through the rights. So he's taking that language and saying, actually, you need the land is how you really establish yourself. So it's very kind of, who is this guy, Is he this kind of spiritual recluse, this Buddhist figure kind of wandering through pristine wilderness, mountains? Or is he a kind of, proto-mass agriculturalist, kind of creating, this is a very, very productive estate, and it's a very sort of self-sufficient estate. Oh no, I've got so much stuff. So maybe I will just switch to Virgil quickly. Oh, so these two concepts, I think, to most people will be somewhat familiar, right? Wu Wei and Ziren. So this was supposed to be with the sort of Zhuangzi passage, effortless action and a kind of spontaneous being that which is as it should be, right? These are kind of key principles. But so what initially, this parallel that I was thinking about came initially from reading the Zhuangzi and then reading Virgil, as you do. Because I think it's really interesting how, this is Virgil, the poet of empire in many ways, right? The Aeneid, epic, Rome, this huge kind of imperial force of nature. And, this is an epic that then contains within it this tiny little vignette, which is gorgeous, of a gardener kind of doing his own thing. And it really reminded me of this idea of what is it to be chunbai, what is it to be purity, to have like a kind of purity and whiteness, to not have a jixin, to not have a machine heart. And these concepts, I think, sort of carry over when you read a text like this. So this is in book 4, Virgil's Aeneid. And he's talking about this, again, an old man, right? This old, somebody deformed, somebody on the, this is not the center of society. And he's occupying these kind of rubbish land, right? It's land that's not valuable, not very fertile, right? But somehow he manages to make of it this productive space for himself, right? This is not a commercial mass endeavor. This is about self-sufficiency, and it's also about a kind of Stoic Epicurean idea of moderation and finding joy in the small things, right? So in happiness, he equaled the wealth of kings, right? First he was to gather the roses, the apples, right? Grim winter doesn't affect him. We have the teeming bees, right? His limes, all of this kind of luxuriance of the gardener in Virgil's Aeneid. So I think this does remind us of a kind of effortlessness, right? This wu-wei concept of he's not working against the land, and he's working with it, and it's sort of spontaneously giving forth its fruits. And then he has this other section where he says, indeed, if I were not already furling my sails for the end of my labors. This is the classic praeteritio technique in Latin literature, where you say what you would do if you only had the time, but you don't, but you'll just sort of say a little bit of it now just to give you a little temptation. Perhaps I might sing of what careful cultivation decks out in rich gardens. And people talk a lot about new materialism and all that. Like, you have exactly that in these ancient texts, right? How the endive rejoices in the streams which it drinks, green banks in parsley, the cucumbers twisting through the grass. Nor would I have kept silent about the late blooming narcissus, the stem of the curling acanthus, the pale ivy, the myrtle that loves the shore. Right? So this is kind of very vibrant, very alive environment that Virgil is sort of hinting at, but then he doesn't actually write the epic of gardening, right? He doesn't do that, but he has this little insertion into this vast epic of what it is to found a nation, right? What it is to take over the world. But he lets us linger almost in this alternative space, right? What if we just done this? What if we just cultivated the land, which is, of course, the ancient Roman ideals, right, of what it is to be a republican, moral, stoic, enduring, good person. This is not the stuff that you get in the empire. So I'll just whip through real quickly. Columella. So Columella is interesting because he's sort of picking up where Virgil tantalizingly left this question of what it might have looked like to have a garden epic, right? Something that is not about killing people and occupying land. And so De Rustica is this large work on agriculture in the 1st century, and he includes this portion that is the first account of how to garden, right? So this is the first sort of, you have Works and Days of Hesiod, which is about farming, but this is, you really have to wait centuries before you get any interest made to the garden. And I think I'll just say, I think it's interesting because Columella, we're in this state of post-Augustan unraveling, right? That we've had the Golden Age, we're moving into Silver Latin. He starts life under the Emperor Domitian, who was, a maniac, and then he's exiled, I think, under Domitian. Then he comes back under Hadrian, who was kind of a nice guy. But this is about, there's something about this retreat to the garden, right, as this safe space, because literally I could be ordered to kill myself tomorrow. This is very, very real existential threat of violence, unpredictability, of that's coloring this work, I think. And so he keeps talking about how everything is very meager, it's very insignificant, this is a tiny little offering. And I like John Henderson's quote here, where he says, like every writer on the subject, Columella composes the garden, right, as this definitionally separate world, whether proudly, apologetically, mock heroically, valued against other areas on the farm, because this is a little inset into this larger work on farming, on agriculture. And in the process, he construes gardening as a validated, i.e. contested, category of culture. So I think that's a nice way of thinking about the category of culture, how it's separate, it's maybe enshrining and doing something very different value-wise to kind of agrarianism as the bedrock of civilization, of productivity, of, it's doing something else. Horace is interesting because he sort of is one of these, a little bit like Xie Lingyun, where you have an idealized version of, I'm a rustic, I don't really care about material things, I'm an Epicurean, I'm a Stoic. To those who want much, much is lacking. He's happy to whom the God grants just enough from a careful hand, right? And he talks about all the things that he doesn't have, right? He doesn't have these bees, he doesn't have sheep and all of this stuff. But Horace was extremely wealthy, right? And he was the right-hand man of Augustus. So he's at the center of imperial power, and he's writing about retreat on his Sabine farm as a sort of, how much, again, when I mentioned earlier, this rhetoric of authenticity, because these are poets, right? This is about crafting an idealized conception of finding some sort of freedom for the self against this turmoil time. So I want to just quickly come back to Tianming, and I didn't actually look at this slide, which I should have done, from the Analects, because this is kind of a key when we're talking about, this dichotomous world of the scholar who mustn't farm and the farmer who mustn't, this is there in the Confucian text, right, where somebody asks about, how do I know how to be a good farmer? How do I know how to be a good gardener? Why do you need to know about this stuff, right? This is not the important matters. And Tianming picks up this Analects passage in his poetry. But I think he's being a little bit disingenuous. I think people tend to think of Chinese poetry as having this purity. This is coming out of the Shijing passage, right? Shidianzhi, right? So the poetry is speaking of its intent. Some has a direct relationship to the soul of the speaker. But there's also, of course, right, craftedness, rhetoricity, whatever. So here, Tianming is saying, Confucius is obsessed with morality, and thought that Fanshu was kind of petty and crude to be asking about gardening and why should we care about this stuff connected to the earth? Here we have Dong Dongshu, right? So he's a very famous Confucian scholar. He never stepped into his garden, right? He's the kind of consummate shizhe, right? The consummate studier who is so into his books that he never even cranks a window, And Tianming is saying, oh, if only I could be like that. But really, of course, he's not saying that, because his whole life is predicated on the idea that he's found his true nature, right? He's rediscovered who he truly is precisely in that reclusion, right? That moving away from, being a scholar, being in service, right? Being the Juns of the Confucian kind of slave to the whoever ruling government is in power, right? And this line, this is a very, very famous one of his poems, right? This Xingben Ai Qiu Shan, right? In his heart, his essential nature, is to love mountains and hills. Gui Yuanxian, right? He has this return, right? What it is to return to the land, to return to the fields and gardens. That this is something that is, a kind of returning to who you truly are, right? This kind of essentialness of the self. And I'll just end with this really lovely quote from Virginia Burris's new book, quite new, because I felt it also spoke to a lot of things that I was trying to say, but not as well. And she's writing about St. Hilarion Cyprus, which is a kind of, so this is a 4th century St. Jerome writing about this saint, and this is a whole other area of thinking about reclusion, right, medieval gardens, what it is to kind of be with the land. And right, I think this last, when she says, a garden is the site of human encounter with other living creatures, an encounter marked by the privilege and burden of consciousness and the capacity to anticipate and plan, right? This is the problem of what it is to be human, right, in very broad strokes, right? That we have rationality, we have the ability to form cities and civilizations and structures and to think about things, to anticipate, to plan. But do we have the ability to truly dwell in and with a place and with all the other elements that make up that environment with us, right, as equals? So I'll stop there because I've thrown a lot at you, but I'll go back to leave the quotations up so that we can maybe think about those as well. Thank you.